I don't know if I've mentioned this before. The instructions tell you to put a spacer between this rear or this inside bracket and the disc rotor, just so that when you go to match drill or put screws in here initially, this can't flex. You don't want to close up the gap between the bracket and the rotor. So I've got a thin piece of plywood here taped in place, and I've got the same thing in the back. Here is a thin piece of plywood taped between the plate and the disc rotor. So I don't know if I've mentioned that before, but that is kind of important. Like I said, it just helps prevent this metal bracket from being pushed into the disc when you're fitting and drilling your wheel fairing. So you can see I've got mine out, or the fairing is now off. So I'm going to go ahead and start countersinking the holes, and I'll have to take this bracket off and rivet it to the fairing, and then I'll put it all back together. I'll do the other side, and then it will be intersection fairing time. Well, so I've made yet another modification. So this bracket mounts with a single bolt through this hole, and it mounts to the wheel nut here, just like I had it before. You bolt it on with a drilled head bolt, and you're supposed to safety wire the drilled head bolt to the pin to keep the bolt from coming out. This is the bracket that you have to set at 90 degrees when you do your fairing. The instructions, they have you rivet this to the fairing. So in order to get the fairing off, you have to reach in here and take this bolt out, which means cutting safety wire, pulling the bolt out. The other thing is that I found out, I did have this riveted to the fairing. When I came back to put the fairing on, I put this on. Now remember, this is riveted to the fairing at this point. I put this on, ran the bolt in, but I didn't tighten the bolt. And then I came around to these two nut plates here, put those screws in, but the fairing was still really loose. Even if I tightened this bolt, I didn't really know where to tighten this because I didn't know what angle this needed to be. This was moving around enough that I was just kind of guessing where this needed to go, so that when I can get the front on and have the front lined up with these holes. Of course, when the plane is on the ground and you're working on this real time, trying to do something with the tire or whatever other kind of maintenance, that's going to be a real pain in the ass, because I don't know how you would get this bolt tight and have this bracket oriented, have the rest of the rear fairing oriented correctly, and be able to get the front on and get these holes on. Because of course, obviously, once you have the front and rear halves together, you can no longer reach in here to tighten this bolt. So I've elected to go with nut plates. So I've taken some, these actually had 2 holes each for rivets, but I lopped off the end hole on each of these, just used a single rivet. So now I'm going to use this. This will get bolted permanently once I get it back on there and realigned appropriately. This bolt will be put on permanently with safety wire. And then when I want to take the fairing on and off, I'll just unscrew it. So let me get this back in place, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So coming back to this bracket, like I said, this bracket is originally meant to be riveted to the rear wheel fairing, but I didn't like that setup at all. I think it makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier just to bolt it in place to the fairing. So all I had done was taken, like I had shown before, I believe, I had taken these types, and I don't know what the number is, I don't even know what they're called, but they're offset nut plates. The bolt is on one side, and then you've got 2 lugs for the rivets only on the other side. So it's not a rivet, the bolt, and then a rivet. It's a rivet bolt. And I cut that first rivet off. That first hole for the rivet I cut off. So I'm only using one rivet to hold each of these in place. And then of course you have to drill the bracket out large enough for the bolt hole. So it's nothing new. It's just, again, by this point you know and understand enough about riveting that I don't have to go into it. The other thing that I decided to do, I went with a much larger washer under the bolt. I noticed that with the recommended washer, that washer is not much bigger in diameter than this bolt head, and there's a lot of flex in the bracket right around the bolt. When you have the fairing attached to this, before you put the front fairing on, you just have the back fairing in place. There's a lot of movement in here. So I went ahead and put in a bigger washer. So I'm working on the right side fairing. I've got it just about ready to go. I'm just doing my final test fits. I've got a couple more countersinks to do after this trial fit. And then I'm going to start addressing those intersection fairings. So I'll get this put back together and I'll be back here in a minute. Next up on these wheel fairings is this. So again, just a quick recap. Let me go on the other side where the lighting I think might be better. So this wheel pant is now finished. The only thing that I need to do, I need to take this rear half off and countersink these 4 holes. Like I've said before, originally these were designed to be riveted in place, but I decided to go with screws. I just wanted to make sure that the screws fit before I went ahead and did my final countersink on these. The rest of this is done. You can see the screws are in place and everything is countersunk. All of it is finished. Also, very, very important is to remember we put those wood spacers between the brake rotor and the back aluminum mounting plate. Once you're finished, make sure you pull those blocks out and that you can spin the tire with those blocks gone. Make sure you pull those spacers out of there when you're done. So again, the way that I had done it, center line of the fuselage, drop down, marked on the floor, come out from there 90 degrees, so many inches, put down tape, marked various inch marks on the tape just because I wasn't sure exactly which one I wanted to use as a reference line. Did the same thing in the back, plumb bob straight down, center line, come out 90 degrees, lay down tape, put corresponding inch marks. And then using my pole, my blue pole, I lay it across the given inch marks on the tape. That projects a line across the underneath of the wheel fairing, and then referencing the straight line on the fairing to the bar just to make sure that the wheel pant is correct this way. The plans give you dimensions for where the tail, how high the tail should be off of the ground. That's just a reference. It obviously depends how high you have the plane jacked up off the ground. But I did an estimate, and then whatever number I came up with on the first pant, I basically took the van's number and then added the height that I have it raised off of the ground, if that makes sense. So I measured from the bottom of the tire down to the ground, and I added that to the dimension that Vans gives. And that's roughly where I had set the tail of that pant. Now that both of them are in place, they're both screwed down, a final check, what I had done was, again, this is just a guesstimate, but I basically took the center of this tail height, this length of the tail. I found center and I made a center mark. I did that on both sides. Then I took the blue pole with a little bit of an extension because it was too short. So using this extension along with the blue bar, I used my digital level and I put the digital level on the bar. I aligned that end of the bar with the center line mark on the tail, and I brought it over and aligned it with this center line mark on this tail and looked at the level, and you want that to be 0. Somehow I was fortunate enough that mine is exactly 0. And again, it's just a guesstimate because this line is probably not exactly center. This center probably doesn't match the center mark on that one exactly. And then when you hold the bar up to the line, of course, you can move that. That could vary a little bit. But just eyeballing this line over to that line with the straight edge and using the digital level, you want those to be even. You don't want one to be higher or lower than the other. So I just verified that that is good. I've checked my lines looking down. Those look good. The only other thing that I could possibly check would be the distance from this tail to that tail, and then compare that to the distance from this nose to that nose. But I can do that as a check. I probably will, but I need to get this kind of stuff out of the way, which I'm not ready to do yet. So I think these are done. I'm going to pull this off. I'm going to countersink those 4 screws. I'm going to put it back together. And then, like I keep saying, onto the intersection fairings. Talk to you guys later.